Welcome to this video on how to format in-text citations using MLA formatting. Let's first go over the general rules for using quotes. So when you're choosing a direct quote to place in your paper, whether it's for a research paper or for a paper on a novel or some other piece of literature, regardless of where that direct quote is coming from, it's going to follow these general rules. So if the quote ends in a period, the period does not get placed inside the quotation marks at the end of the quote. This is actually a really common mistake that is made in MLA formatting. So make sure you remember, do not put a period at the end of the quote inside the quotation marks. If the quote ends in a question mark or an exclamation point, however, the punctuation does get placed inside the quotation marks at the end of the quote. After the quotation marks, include your in-text citation in parentheses. Make sure to always place a period after the parentheses, since it is technically the end of the sentence after the in-text citation. And that's why we don't place a period in the quotation marks, because that period, it's denoting the end of the sentence. So we want to put that where the end of the sentence truly is, which is after that in-text citation. So if you take a look at this color-coded example, it shows you that when you're putting this direct quote into your paper, you should always begin it with quotation marks. Then make sure you are typing the exact direct quote exactly as it appears within the text that you're pulling it from. Then you end the quotation marks. Then you begin the parentheses, and inside of them goes the author's last name followed by the page number. A period comes after that closed parentheses. So let's look at the example. It seemed to Tom that his schoolmates never would get done holding inquests on dead cats, and thus keeping his trouble present to his mind. Twain, 98. So once again, notice that the period comes after the parentheses at the end of the quote. So now I wanted to highlight the specifics for formatting an in-text citation. We just looked at an example, so I wanted to point out some of the general rules that we didn't explicitly go over when we looked at that example. So notice that all that appears within the parentheses is the author's last name followed by the page number. That's it. So let's look at another example with just the in-text citation. I have my parentheses. Within them, I have Tolkien 42. This is what I want us to specifically notice. There is no P for page number placed ahead of the number, nor is there a comma or a period between the last name and the page number. These are common mistakes people make because they see them in other styles of formatting like APA, even Chicago style. So it's really important to note that for MLA formatting, we do not place anything between the author's last name and the page number aside from a space. So do not add more than what is required within MLA formatting, or else you're actually going to format it incorrectly. So now we're going to start diving into some of the more complex aspects of MLA formatting for an in-text citation. So for example, a question that gets asked a lot in the ELA classroom of teachers is, well, how do we cite a source without a known author if the author's last name is a requirement of the in-text citation? Well, the reality is sometimes sources do not include an author. So here's what you should do in that situation. If there is no author, use a shortened title of the work instead of an author's last name. You place the title in quotation marks if it's a short work, such as an article, or you italicize that title if it's from a longer work, a play, a book, an entire website, and then you continue to provide the page number. So if you look below, there are two examples you can look through. An example of an article without a listed author. So if you take a look, I listed the full citation underneath the in-text citation so that you could see what it means when we're saying that you should use a shortened title of the work. You know, when we're doing an in-text citation, we don't want it to be so long that it distracts the reader from the content. So, for example, in the very first example of an article without a listed author, We have a full citation where the article title is The Impact of Global Warming in North America. However, we're going to shorten that for the in-text citation to simply Impact of Global Warming. And we're going to keep that in quotation marks so that the reader is aware that that is a shorter piece, in this case an article. So then if we look at the second example, an example of a book without a listed author, so a book, a longer piece, as opposed to a shorter piece, the article, this time the full citation is from a piece, The Epic of Gilgamesh. And if we take a look in the in-text citation, you see that all we have listed here now is epic. Again, shortening that title, but this time we're placing it in italics because the MLA formatting rule for citing a longer work title is by placing it in italics. So sometimes we may find ourselves using an online database to find research. And so it's really important to understand that online databases have their very own special type of in-text citation, and that is because they lack page numbers. Most online databases are not going to offer any type of page numbers. Therefore, instead, you offer a paragraph number. This means you must count each paragraph until you reach the paragraph where your quote has been taken from. Then you use that paragraph number in parentheses after the author's last name, or after the text's title if there is no author, as we recently talked about. So in this example, you're going to see that we need to denote that this is not a page number, that this is a paragraph number. So after we have the author's last name, we are going to actually denote that by writing PAR period. So in the first example, you can see it says Greenblatt, PAR period, followed by the number 4 to let us know that this quote appeared in paragraph 4. If there's more than one paragraph being quoted, if you're using an ellipsis or something along those lines because you want to use something that appears a little bit later, so it appears in 2 different paragraphs, all you would do is change the PAR to say PARS period. So if we take a look at that example, it says Greenblatt PARS period 4-5. Now that's because they are consecutive. Now say I was pulling 2 quotes, one from the 4th paragraph and one from the 6th. Instead, I would do 4-6 as denoted in the final example. As I'm sure you figured out by now, MLA formatting requires a lot of different rules depending on the different source where you're finding your information from. So if you're using a website, once again, you don't have page numbers the same way you don't within an online database. However, we don't follow the online database rule. Websites do not require page numbers, nor do they require paragraph numbers. Instead, in this case, you only use the author's last name. If there is no author, then you use the web page title and quotation marks. So, for example, if I was having a direct quote from a website and there was an author's last name and that last name was Burke, the only thing that would appear within the parentheses would be the last name Burke. In the second example, you could see that if I am pulling a quote from a website where there is no author on the web page, then I would just use the web page's title. And because that is a shorter piece, I would put that in quotation marks. So pretend I am pulling information, a direct quote from a web page titled Queen Elizabeth I. I would place that in quotation marks. That would be placed within parentheses, and that would be it. That's all I have to do for my website in-text citation. I wanted to throw a bonus into this video because one question that comes up frequently is how do we format quotes that have both dialogue and narration? So this is something that appears a lot, and if you're using in-text citations, that means a lot of times that means you'll be using at least 1 or 2 direct quotes. So hopefully this helps you in that vein if you end up having a direct quote that has both dialogue and narration. So first, let's start off by saying that if a direct quote is either fully narration or fully dialogue, it gets placed in quotation marks, regardless of it being narration or dialogue. Some students think that if you use if it's fully dialogue, you need to use triple quotes, and that's simply not true. Whether it's narration or dialogue, as long as it's fully one or fully the other, it simply gets placed in quotation marks. However, the difficulty comes in when there's a mix of both narration and dialogue. Then we need to use both quotation marks and single quotes. And I'm hoping that this helps clarify how to do this because it's actually pretty easy. The entire direct quote gets placed in quotation marks. So you always begin the direct quote with regular quotation marks. Then, before the first word of the dialogue, place a single quote. After the last word of the dialogue, place another single quote. And then, as many times as that dialogue occurs again and again between the narration and the dialogue going back and forth, you simply place that dialogue in single quotes. Once you get to the last word of the entire direct quote, you place that entire quote in final closing quotation marks. So that might sound confusing. So if it sounds confusing, I hope that the images here, the color coding will help you. Not images, but color coding, because I put the quotation marks, which remember kind of hug the entire piece. They go at the very beginning and the very end. I place them in red. And then the single quotes, which go around the dialogue, they're in blue. So if we look at the example, it says, "Don't talk rot, Whitney," said Rainsford. "You're a big game hunter, not a philosopher. Who cares how a jaguar feels?" So we can tell that almost all of that direct quote is dialogue because most of the dialogue appears within blue single quotes. And so we can see that the only part that is narration is said Rainsford because that's the only part not included in those blue single quotes. And then as you can see, I'm just going to repeat one last time that the entire direct quote is hugged by those red quotation marks. And then final reminder, the period, don't forget that period after the in-text citation. Thanks for listening.